Virginia McCaskey, and the death of George Halas Jr. In 1979, George Muggs Halas Jr., the heir apparent to the Chicago Bears, died suddenly of a heart attack at just 54 years old. At the time, his death was ruled natural causes, and the Bears remained in the hands of the Halas family, eventually passing to his sister, Virginia Halas McCaskey. But decades later, a stunning twist reopened old wounds and sparked whispers of conspiracy. In the 2000s, during a bitter family inheritance dispute, Muggs's body was exhumed under court order. The forensic pathologist hired for the case, Dr. Michael Baden, made a shocking discovery. Most of his internal organs had been removed and replaced with sawdust. That finding, reported in the Los Angeles Times, immediately fueled suspicion that something about Muggs's death wasn't what it seemed. For conspiracy theorists, this detail became evidence of a dark family plot. Some fans whispered that Virginia, now over 100 years old and still the owner of the team, had benefited from her brother's suspiciously premature death, inheriting control of the Bears in what amounted to a quiet kinslaying. Lawsuits among Halas family members over money only added to the intrigue, making the Bears' ownership history seem cursed. To be clear, authorities have never found evidence of foul play. Officially, Muggs Halas died of a heart attack, but the bizarre autopsy report, with organs missing and replaced, left an eerie aura around his legacy. The drowning of Carol Rosenblum. On April 2nd, 1979, Carol Rosenblum, then the owner of the Los Angeles Rams, went for a swim in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Florida. Minutes later, his body was found floating face down. The death was ruled an accidental drowning. But from the very beginning, the circumstances raised eyebrows. Rosenblum was 72. But he was in good physical condition and an experienced swimmer. Autopsy reports noted bruises on his body, particularly his legs, which fueled speculation he may not have simply drowned. Some whispers suggested foul play, either at the hands of organized crime. Rosenblum was known to have gambling connections, or from someone much closer to home. That suspicion inevitably fell on his much younger wife, Georgia Frontier. Just days after his death, she inherited controlling ownership of the Rams. The suddenness of his passing, combined with her windfall, led some to believe she had orchestrated his demise. Rosenblum's own son publicly said he did not believe the death was accidental, further stoking conspiracy talk. Over time, the rumors only grew. The parallels to a then-popular novel, which depicted an NFL owner assassinated by a scuba diver, kept the story alive. Was Rosenblum a victim of mob retribution, an aspiring widow, or simply an accident in the surf? Officially, authorities found no evidence of foul play, but the doubts never faded. Marvin Harrison's secret shootings. Marvin Harrison is remembered as one of the quietest and most reliable wide receivers in NFL history, a Hall of Famer who spent his entire career with the Indianapolis Colts. But after retirement, his name became tied to one of the strangest and darkest conspiracy theories in NFL lore. In April 2008, a man named Dwight Dixon got into a dispute with Harrison outside a car wash he owned in Philadelphia. Later that day, Dixon was shot multiple times. He survived and told police that Harrison had pulled the trigger. Investigators recovered a gun registered to Harrison that was linked ballistically to shell casings found at the scene. Yet, despite this, prosecutors said there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. A year later, the story got even more chilling. Dixon was shot and killed by an unknown assailant. Before he died, Dixon reportedly told officers he believed Harrison had been behind previous attempts on his life. Philadelphia police admitted they considered Harrison a person of interest, but again, no charges were filed. This sequence of events, a Hall of Fame player accused of a shooting, the key witness later murdered, and the case remaining unsolved, has fueled speculation that Harrison got away with something thanks to his influence or intimidation. To this day, Harrison has never been convicted of any violent crime. Officially, it remains an unsolved case. But for conspiracy theorists, it's one of the NFL's darkest whispers that Marvin Harrison, the soft-spoken superstar, lived a double life the league never wanted to confront. By the way, I'm going to be posting a lot here, so it would mean a lot if you subscribed and dropped a like for the algorithm. Ray Lewis's Deer Antler Potion. In the lead-up to Super Bowl 47 in 2013, one of the strangest sports controversies in NFL history broke out, and it centered on Ray Lewis, the heart of the Baltimore Ravens. A Sports Illustrated report claimed Lewis had used an unusual supplement called deer antler spray to help recover from a torn triceps earlier that season. The spray supposedly contained IGF-1, a hormone banned by the NFL because it can promote muscle repair and growth. To make matters worse, the supplier even produced a recorded phone call where Lewis asked about the product. The story dropped during Super Bowl week, a timing many Ravens fans saw as no coincidence. Lewis, furious at the accusations, denied everything. He called the report stupidity and said, "God has provided me with everything I need," and technically, he wasn't caught breaking any rule. The NFL had no tests for IGF-1 at the time, meaning there was no way to prove whether he had used it. The league quickly announced there would be no investigation or punishment. That quick dismissal gave rise to conspiracy theories on both sides. Some believe the NFL looked the other way, not wanting to tarnish the legacy of one of its biggest stars in his farewell game. Others thought the timing of the report itself was a deliberate attempt to distract Baltimore or tarnish Lewis's storybook ending. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. Lewis may have tried the spray in desperation, and the NFL preferred to quietly let it slide. The 90s Cowboys cover-ups. The Dallas Cowboys of the 1990s were a soap opera. Stories of wild parties, drugs, and late-night chaos became part of the team's reputation. But conspiracy theorists believe what fans saw in the headlines was only the tip of the iceberg. The Cowboys famously had a White House, a private rental house near team facilities where players held parties with drugs and escorts. Star wideout Michael Irvin was constantly in the news for off-field issues, from drug charges to fights. Yet, despite these controversies, punishments often seemed light, and suspicions grew that Jerry Jones, the Dallas police, and even the NFL itself were working to keep the Cowboys' biggest names on the field. The most infamous example came in 1996, when Irvin and teammate Eric Williams were accused of sexual assault. The accuser later recanted her story, and charges disappeared. But many conspiracy-minded fans wondered if hush money or influence played a role. Around the same time, Irvin allegedly stabbed a teammate in the neck with scissors during a training camp fight. But the incident was handled internally, never turning into a major scandal. Were the Cowboys actually protected by a web of influence? Officially, the NFL did suspend Irvin 5 games in 1996, and some players did face legal consequences. But the idea that America's team was allowed to bend the rules to keep its stars playing has lingered for decades. The Steelers' steroid dynasty. The Pittsburgh Steelers of the 1970s are remembered as one of the greatest dynasties in NFL history. 4 Super Bowls in 6 years, anchored by the Steel Curtain defense, and a roster stacked with Hall of Famers. But behind that success, a shadowy theory has lingered for decades, that the dynasty was fueled by steroids, and that the NFL looked the other way. At the time, steroids were not banned in the league. Dianabol and other performance-enhancing drugs were widely available, and several former Steelers later admitted to using them. Offensive lineman Steve Corson openly talked about it in the 1980s. Other players, including Hall of Famer Mike Webster, were linked to use. One former teammate, Andy Russell, even claimed half the team was experimenting with steroids by the late 1970s. This isn't just speculation, it's part of the historical record. The conspiracy angle comes in when you consider how little the NFL did about it. Rival fans, especially those of the Raiders and Cowboys, have long accused the league of ignoring an open secret because Pittsburgh was a flagship franchise. Bigger, stronger players made for a better product, and the Steelers' dominance was good for business. Testing for steroids didn't even begin until 1987, nearly a decade after the Steelers' peak. Did steroids decide championships? That's impossible to prove. The Steelers were immensely talented and well-coached regardless. But conspiracy theorists argue their size and strength advantage was chemically boosted, and that the NFL engaged in a conspiracy of silence, choosing not to expose what was happening in locker rooms league-wide. Bill Callahan sabotaged the Raiders. Super Bowl 37 in January 2003 was supposed to be the crowning moment for the Oakland Raiders. They had the league's top offense, MVP quarterback Rich Gannon, and a shot at their first championship since the 1980s. Instead, they were humiliated 48-21 by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a team coached by their former head coach John Gruden. A decade later, two Raiders legends, Tim Brown and Jerry Rice, dropped a bombshell. Both claimed that then head coach Bill Callahan had sabotaged the game by changing the Raiders' offensive game plan just 2 days before the Super Bowl. According to them, Oakland had spent the week preparing a run-heavy approach to attack Tampa Bay's defense, but on Friday, Callahan scrapped it for a pass-first scheme that played directly into the Buccaneers' strengths. The result was a disaster. Gannon threw 5 interceptions, 3 returned for touchdowns, and the Raiders looked utterly unprepared. Brown and Rice even suggested Callahan had ulterior motives, that he disliked the Raiders organization and had close ties to Gruden, implying he threw the game to help his friend. Callahan furiously denied the accusation, calling it ludicrous. Other Raiders pointed to different reasons for the collapse, like Pro Bowl center Barrett Robbins going missing the night before the game, which disrupted the offense. And Gruden himself admitted afterward that he taught his Buccaneers defenders all of Oakland's audibles from his time as their coach, which may explain why Tampa seemed to know every play. Still, the idea that a head coach intentionally sabotaged his own team in the Super Bowl is one of the juiciest conspiracy theories in NFL history. The 49ers' salary cap collusion. In the late 1990s, the San Francisco 49ers were still riding the tail end of their dynasty years. But behind the scenes, the team was breaking the rules to keep its roster stacked with stars. And eventually, it all came crashing down. In 1998, an NFL investigation revealed that the 49ers had been secretly hiding parts of player contracts through off-book deals. Executives were cutting under-the-table agreements with veterans like Steve Young and Brent Jones, promising deferred payments that weren't reported on the team's official salary cap sheet. In other words, they were keeping 2 sets of books, one for the NFL and one for themselves. When the scheme was uncovered, the league came down hard. The 49ers were fined heavily, lost draft picks, and GM Carmen policy was hit with personal penalties. It was one of the most blatant examples of a team deliberately conspiring to cheat the cap in NFL history. The conspiracy element isn't just what San Francisco did, but what rival fans suspect the NFL overlooked. Some believe the league turned a blind eye to similar practices during the 49ers' 1980s and early 90s dynasty years, only cracking down once outside pressure, including IRS involvement, forced their hand. The fact that the 49ers were able to keep so much high-priced talent under the cap for so long continues to fuel speculation that the league quietly let it slide until it couldn't anymore. At its core, it was a coordinated conspiracy between team executives and player agents to skirt the rules and gain an edge. The NFL eventually made an example of the 49ers, but the suspicion remains that they weren't the only team doing it. They were just the ones who got caught. Mark Gastineau's sudden retirement. In 1988, Mark Gastineau was one of the most famous defensive players in the NFL. The Jets' pass rusher had already set the single-season sack record and was a household name. Then, in the middle of the season, he stunned the football world by announcing his retirement, citing his fiance's battle with cancer as the reason. But almost immediately, rumors began to swirl that there was more to the story. Just a year earlier, the NFL had officially introduced a drug policy, including testing for steroids. Reports later surfaced that Gastineau had tested positive multiple times and was facing a suspension. Conspiracy theorists believe his mid-season retirement wasn't purely personal. It was a quiet exit, orchestrated to avoid a public scandal. Years later, those whispers gained credibility. In interviews during the 1990s, Gastineau admitted he had used steroids during his career. The New York Times and ESPN both reported that he had indeed tested positive in 1988 and would have faced a major fine or suspension if he had continued playing. Instead, he left abruptly, and the league avoided having to make an example out of one of its most recognizable stars. The Giants' fake injuries, one of the most notorious caught-on-camera conspiracies in recent NFL history, came on a Monday Night Football game in 2011 when the New York Giants played the St. Louis Rams. The Rams were running a fast-paced, no-huddle offense when, suddenly, two Giants defenders, Deion Grant and Jaquan Williams, both collapsed to the turf without being touched. The timing was suspicious. Both players went down almost simultaneously, stopping the drive in its tracks. On the broadcast, cameras even caught Giants veterans gesturing from the sideline just before the falls. The Rams' players and coaches were furious, convinced New York was faking injuries to stall their momentum. The Giants denied everything, of course, but the replays told a different story. Grant initially began to get back up, then seemed to remember and flopped back down to the ground. The scene was so blatant that fans booed loudly, and broadcasters openly questioned whether it was staged. The NFL never fined the Giants, but within days, the league office sent a memo to all 32 teams, warning that faking injuries to slow down hurry-up offenses would be considered a violation of the rules. The problem? There's almost no way to enforce it. If a player says they're hurt, the officials have to stop the game. To conspiracy theorists, this was proof that defenses, sometimes with coaches' instructions, orchestrate these injuries as a kind of hidden tactic. $100K per loss, the Dolphins' tank plan. In 2022, one of the most explosive allegations in NFL history came not from a player, but from a head coach. Brian Flores, who had just been fired by the Miami Dolphins, filed a lawsuit against the league for racial discrimination, and buried within the legal filing was a shocking claim that Dolphins owner Stephen Ross had offered him $100,000 for every loss during the 2019 season. According to Flores, Ross wanted to tank for draft position. Miami was supposed to be awful that year, setting itself up to grab the #1 pick in a class that included LSU quarterback Joe Burrow. The Dolphins did start 0-7, but Flores refused to coach to lose. Miami rallied late in the year and won 5 games, dropping them to the #5 pick, where they drafted Tua Tagovailoa instead. The NFL investigated the allegations. While the league acknowledged Ross made the comment, they claimed it was a joke and found no hard evidence of an actual tanking bounty system. Ross was never punished directly for the tanking accusation, though he was later fined and suspended for unrelated tampering violations. But to many fans, Flores' account rings true. The idea that an NFL owner would openly pay for losses shook the sport, reinforcing long-held fears about teams deliberately bottoming out for draft picks. Critics believe the league swept it under the rug, downplaying the severity to avoid shaking fan confidence in the integrity of games. Suck for luck. The 2011 Colts. In 2011, the Indianapolis Colts went from perennial Super Bowl contender to the NFL's worst team almost overnight. The reason was simple. Peyton Manning missed the entire season after neck surgery. Without him, the Colts stumbled to a 2-14 record, but the timing raised eyebrows because the very next draft featured Andrew Luck, one of the most hyped quarterback prospects in decades. From the moment Indy started losing, rival fans accused them of suck for luck. The idea was that the Colts weren't just bad, they were intentionally keeping it that way to secure the #1 overall pick. Instead of aggressively seeking a capable veteran replacement for Manning, they trotted out Kerry Collins, Curtis Painter, and Dan Orlovsky, a trio that seemed doomed to fail. To conspiracy theorists, that wasn't bad luck. It was by design, and it paid off. The Colts landed the #1 pick, drafted Luck, and immediately transitioned from the Manning era to another franchise quarterback. The optics were almost too perfect. The 1 year Manning goes down, Indy bottoms out just in time to grab the most polished QB prospect since John Elway. Officially, the organization denied tanking. Coaches and players never admitted to anything less than full effort, but the suspicion has never faded. Was it pure coincidence that a team so competitive for a decade collapsed just in time to land a generational quarterback? Or did ownership quietly set the roster up to fail, knowing what was at stake? The Pat Tillman cover-up. Pat Tillman was one of the most unique figures in NFL history. A hard-hitting safety for the Arizona Cardinals, he walked away from millions in 2002 to enlist in the U.S. Army after 9/11. 2 years later, he was killed in Afghanistan. The official story at first was simple. Tillman died heroically in an ambush. But the truth was much darker, and the way it was handled gave rise to one of the most enduring conspiracies in modern sports. Weeks after his death, it was revealed Tillman had not been killed by enemy fire, but by friendly fire. Army officials knew this within days, yet continued to promote the false story of a heroic firefight, even staging a televised memorial built on a lie. Tillman's family felt deliberately misled, and congressional hearings later confirmed there was an intentional cover-up at high levels of the military to protect the Army's image and avoid embarrassment. The conspiracy extends beyond that confirmed deception. Some theorists believe Tillman's death wasn't an accident at all. They point to the strange details. Tillman was shot 3 times in the forehead at close range. His personal journal and uniform were burned, and he had become openly critical of the war effort. Was he silenced because he no longer fit the military's heroic narrative? Official investigations said no, finding no evidence of foul play. But the suspicions never went away. Warren Moon and the MVP that never was. Warren Moon is one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history, a 9-time Pro Bowler who threw for over 49,000 yards and became the first black QB enshrined in the Hall of Fame. But there's one honor he never received, and many fans believe that's no accident. Moon was never named NFL MVP. The strongest case came in 1990. That year, Moon led the league in passing yards and touchdowns, won Offensive Player of the Year, and piloted Houston's run-and-shoot offense with jaw-dropping efficiency. Yet when it came time for MVP voting, he finished second behind Joe Montana. Critics argue Montana's award was more about reputation, while Moon's historic season was overlooked. That snub gave rise to a conspiracy theory that Moon was denied the MVP because he was black. In the late 1980s and early 90s, black quarterbacks still faced deep-seated skepticism. Moon had already been forced to spend 5 years in the CFL before even getting a chance in the NFL, a delay he himself attributed to racial bias among scouts and executives. Fans who believe the theory point out that if Moon had been white, his 1990 numbers and dominance would have made him a lock for MVP. There's no hard evidence of collusion among voters, but the suspicion persists. The narrative is that MVP voters of that era were hesitant to give the league's top award to a black quarterback, even one performing at an elite level. To Moon's supporters, the fact that he never won despite multiple MVP caliber seasons is proof of institutional bias. The Pottsville Maroons championship curse. In 1925, the Pottsville Maroons were one of the NFL's toughest small-town teams. That year, they beat the Chicago Cardinals late in the season and were recognized by most as the rightful champions. But days later, NFL President Joe Carr stripped Pottsville of the title, claiming they had violated league rules by playing an unauthorized exhibition game against a team of Notre Dame All-Stars in Philadelphia, territory belonging to another franchise. The championship was retroactively handed to the Cardinals. The Maroons and their fans were outraged. They insisted the league bent its own rules to favor a big market team over a coal mining town. Pottsville even sued for recognition decades later, but the NFL never budged. Out of that bitterness grew a local legend, the Pottsville Curse. According to the tale, supporters of the Maroons vowed the Cardinals franchise would never win another championship until the 1925 title was restored. Whether coincidence or curse, the results were eerie. The Cardinals, later the St. Louis Cardinals, then the Arizona Cardinals, became one of the most snake-bitten franchises in pro football. After winning an NFL title in 1947, they went decades without another, suffering heartbreak after heartbreak. Even today, some Cardinals fans joke that their team is haunted by Pottsville's stolen crown. ESPN and others have retold the story, highlighting how a decision nearly a century ago might still loom over the league's oldest franchise. Of course, there's no proof of any supernatural curse, but as long as the Cardinals continue to struggle, the legend of Pottsville's revenge lives on. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot here, so it would mean a lot if you subscribed. Thanks for watching.